Welcome, traveler, to the shadowed halls of medieval France, an age of luminous pageantry, hidden dangers, and rulers whose every choice could reshape the fate of kingdoms. Before you unfolds the gripping tale of King Philip IV, known as Philip the Fair. He was a monarch whose icy beauty masked a heart forged in loss and ambition, whose stern vision pulled France from splintered feudal dust into the dawn of royal absolutism. But beneath his calm and the gilded splendor of Paris lurks a world of secret brotherhoods, ancient feuds, and a curse that would echo through centuries. This is not only the story of a king, but of power's price, not just of justice, but of vengeance whispered in torchlit corridors. To follow Philip's path is to witness love and betrayal, faith and ruin, and the fall of legends whose embers still glow in the soul of France. Philip the Fair, Part 1, Childhood, First 2,000 Words. The Dawn of a Future King. The first light of a brisk April morning in 1268 filtered through the vast stone corridors of Fontainebleau, casting a pale shimmer on the cradle where a boy stirred. Even in infancy, there was an ethereal beauty about Philip, the fourth son of King Philip III of France and Isabella of Aragon. The palace, forever echoing with the measured steps of courtiers and the whisper of silken robes, now throbbed with expectation, for a prince was a realm's promise incarnate. From the beginning, the court marveled at his striking appearance. His complexion was so pale he earned, even as a boy, the name Le Bel, the Fair. He had a narrow, sculpted face, high cheekbones, and an intense blue gaze that seemed too old for years so few. Yet, beneath those delicate features was an unyielding resolve, a germ of willpower that, nursed by hardship, would one day forge one of France's most formidable monarchs. His early days were marked by both privilege and sorrow. The palace, with its grandeur, also nurtured intrigue, a nest of ambition and delicate alliances. But for a young prince, the world was narrower. Universe of lessons in Latin, faith, and the art of war, overseen by stern, noble tutors and the ever-watchful eyes of his parents. Isabella, his mother, imparted to Philip a gentle piety and the wisdom of royalty, counseling patience and uprightness. "A king," she would whisper during evening prayers, "must remember that all he has is not his own, but his people's." But their time together was heartbreakingly brief. In 1271, on a journey to the south, Isabella fell ill with a fever and died. Philip, scarcely 3 years old, lost more than a mother. He lost the warmth that had shielded him from the cold ambitions of court. His father remarried soon after, to Marie of Brabant, a woman as ambitious as she was charming. For the young Philip, her presence meant an even stricter upbringing. The court of France was beset with rivalries and suspicions. Even in the nursery, alliances were quietly forged and broken. His stepmother, keen to secure her own children's future, never let Philip forget that affection in royal circles was a currency, not a given. 2. Lessons in power and shadows. Philip's formal education began early. His tutors, men of vast learning, instilled in him the doctrines of Aquinas, the codes of chivalry, and the intricate lattice of feudal law. He excelled, especially in matters of governance and statecraft. He saw his older brothers, Louis and Robert, schooled in the same arts, their fates uncertain. After all, childhood mortality was a specter that haunted even kings. When Louis, the eldest, died young, and Robert followed not long after, the crown's expectations fell abruptly on Philip. He was now the Dauphin, the heir apparent, and the French nobility both embraced and scrutinized him. It was during these years that young Philip developed his legendary reserve. He learned to listen rather than speak, to study the faces of those who bowed before him, detecting flattery and deceit behind their smiles. A childhood tragedy of immense weight struck again in 1276. His other younger brother died under mysterious circumstances. The court swirled with rumors. Some whispered that Marie of Brabant was not blameless. Philip, now keenly aware of the dangers lurking around the throne, withdrew further into himself, learning to mask his emotions behind a stoic, almost icy calm. The Holy Church was never far from the royal life. Every morning and night, Philip was led to the chapel by his nurse and tutors, genuflecting before golden icons and reciting the Lord's Prayer. It was here that his relationship with faith deepened. God, for Philip, was not simply a comfort, but a source of legitimacy and power. The boy who had lost his mother found solace and certainty in ritual, learning to balance humility before God with the certainty of his divine right as heir. 3. The world beyond the palace walls. Despite the rigid confines of etiquette and schooling, there were other lessons to be learned. As he grew, Philip was taken on journeys through the kingdom, accompanied by his tutors and a retinue of guards. From the forests of Fontainebleau to the bustling streets of Paris, he saw the lives of his subjects firsthand. He witnessed famine during bad harvests, riots over taxes, and the devout processions on holy days. Though introverted, Philip was acutely observant, absorbing not just the discontent of the peasants, but also the cunning of the nobility. More than once he witnessed the petty corruptions of local officials, the greed of tax collectors, and the rare but undeniable loyalty of a simple village priest. Through these travels, he developed a conviction. Only a strong, centralized monarchy could bring justice to such a turbulent land. Stories of the East, of the Crusades and the glories and failures of Christian knights reached Philip's ears often. The order of the Knights Templar, in particular, fascinated the young prince. Their stories, enmeshed with both violence and piety, seemed to offer an ideal of sacred knighthood. Even in his youth, Philip sensed that the ideals of nobility and chivalry could both ennoble and threaten the throne, depending on whose loyalty they commanded. 4. Childhood's end. When Philip was but 16, his father died unexpectedly during a campaign against the rebellious Aragonese. The realm was thrown into tumult. France, always powerful, was now vulnerable. The transition from boy to king was swift and uncompromising. On a dull autumn day in 1285, as bells tolled across Paris, Philip was crowned King of France in Reims Cathedral. The sacred oil shimmered on his forehead as the archbishop intoned prayers. Among the shouts of "Vive le Roi" and the trumpets that shook the stones, the new king stood, a solitary figure wreathed in the ancient hopes and anxieties of his people. The child who had watched and waited now had power. Those who looked at him then saw not the fair-faced prince, but a glacial force, enigmatic, inscrutable, possessing a beauty that was both magnetic and dangerously remote. France would change under his hand. Few could have foreseen just how much. As the years passed, the boy king who had been raised amidst whispers and shadows began to confront the burdens of rule with an icy composure that seemed to chill even his closest advisors. From his earliest days as sovereign, Philip understood that his hold on the throne was neither absolute nor unconditional. The realm seethed beneath the surface with ancient quarrels and furtive ambitions, and his youth was as much a weapon against him as it was a symbol of promise. The coronation was scarcely concluded when the pressures of kingship began to weigh on his slender shoulders. He sat often in the Hall of Mirrors at the Louvre, cloaked in the gentle golden light of Parisian afternoon, poring over ledgers and lists of vassals, tax records written in 1,000 hands, missives from bishops and barons, each demanding, beseeching, threatening in equal measure. The faces of his council, older and more cunning than he, formed a silent ring around him, their carefully chosen words floating in the air like perfume or poison. For a year, Philip balanced between careful listening and determined action, determined to build his own authority as France's true monarch. Outside the palaces, the land was restless. Famine and disease plagued the countryside, and the tongues of discontent flickered more fiercely in the mouths of merchants and peasants alike. The air of Paris was thick with the smoke of forges and the cries of peddlers, but beneath it was the persistent murmur of those who wondered if this pale, beautiful king would fall like so many before him. Philip ventured among them, sometimes in disguise, sometimes flanked by his knights, always watchful, always learning. He saw hope, and he saw hunger. The future he dreamed for France would demand more than gentleness. It would require resolve, and more, it would require change. He was 17 when he married Jeanne of Navarre, a union of both strategic advantage and unexpected warmth. Jeanne was young, clever, and spirited, a forceful presence whose laughter could fill a hall and whose reasoned counsel could steady even Philip's most difficult choices. Their partnership would endure in its way, a royal bond tighter than many in those brittle times, sealed by shared nights at the hearth and the laughter of their children. Yet, as love blossomed, so too did the intricacies of governance deepen around them. Philip was determined to bring order to a realm fragmenting beneath the surface of its glory. He dreamed of a France united not by threat alone, but by the iron of administration and the sinew of law. He strengthened royal justice, sending his trusted agents, the royal bailli, throughout the kingdom to ensure the king's peace was kept. He waged a patient war against corruption, stripping power from over-mighty lords, standardizing coinage, and setting harsh penalties for those who believed themselves beyond the reach of the crown. Many chafed at his reforms, calling Philip cold, even inhuman, a prince of marble in a realm of blood and earth. Yet the king pressed on, convinced that France must become something greater than a patchwork of fiefs and privileges. His resolve was sorely tested by external threats. In 1294, war broke with England, provoked by their rival claims to Gascony. The fighting was fierce, and Philip's youth was now judged not by courtiers, but by generals and soldiers on muddy battlefields. Messages arrived at all hours, losses in the south, victories snatched in the north, castles besieged, towns burnt. But Philip held firm. He met with his war council deep into the night, studying maps by candlelight, his brow furrowed, silent except to issue brief, decisive commands that left no doubt as to who was sovereign. By 1299, through exhaustion and strategic marriages more than decisive arms, a tense peace was patched together, Gascony slipping from open conflict into uneasy truce. In the years that followed, Philip's vision turned inward toward a deeper struggle, the defense of royal authority against any power that would dare challenge it. In the heart of every bishop's palace, in the bustling halls of every guild, he sensed the fraying edges of his kingdom's unity. And above all, there was the Church, the greatest temporal rival to any European crown. Pope Boniface VIII, haughty and absolute, sparred openly with Philip over taxes, church autonomy, and the very nature of kingship itself. Letters flew between Paris and Rome, each more bitter than the last. When the Pope threatened excommunication, Philip responded with icy defiance, drafting statutes that would limit the Pope's influence within France. The confrontation escalated, at last exploding into violence. Papal legates were harassed, and Boniface himself was humiliated by royal agents at Anagni, the spectre of royal power flaring brighter than the authority of the Holy See. Such victories, though, brought no peace to Philip's soul. He moved through the palace with the gait of a man twice his age, his soft features now shadowed with weariness. Yet those who looked closer saw the fire undiminished in his gaze. If anything, struggle had hardened him. He was no longer the uncertain youth, but a king whose will, once formed, was unbreakable. It was during these formative years that rumors began to swirl about the Order of the Knights Templar, whose stories had haunted Philip's imagination since boyhood. Their fortresses dotted the countryside. Their wealth rivaled that of kings, and their loyalty was pledged not to the throne, but to the distant Pope. France owed them much. They had bled and died for the cross in the Holy Land, protected pilgrims, and for a time served as royal bankers. But respect had curdled into suspicion in the king's sharp mind. How had these warrior monks, vowed to poverty and obedience, become so rich, so secretive, so powerful that they seemed a kingdom unto themselves? Philip, master of patience and subtlety, watched and waited. While he expanded royal influence at home and made fragile peace abroad, he kept close counsel only with those he trusted absolutely. The years of his youth had taught him that power unchecked was power dangerous, whether in a nobleman, a cleric, or an order sworn to serve God above all. But those shadows of rivalry, the old ghosts of childhood loss and treacherous alliances, still haunted his quietest hours. As Paris fell into silence and the moonlight pooled on cold stone floors, Philip would sometimes wander the galleries and halls, searching not only for the enemies that threatened his realm, but for some echo of certainty, a sign that the path he walked was the right one for himself and for France. The kingdom he shepherded was growing, shaping itself in the image of his own exacting spirit, and yet the cost was already mounting. Still, Philip pressed onward through the gathering dusk of his youth, toward the storm that awaited him in the full flowering of his reign. Philip's maturity brought with it not only a hardened will, but an ever sharper understanding of his nation's fragile unity and the true cost of power. By now, the king the French people saw on major processions and in council halls was a figure of unwavering composure and calculated restraint, a monarch less guided by fiery charisma than by the cold logic of his vision for France. The weight of sorrow and vigilance that had shadowed his youth was now replaced by a ruthless devotion to order and royal strength. Through the intricate corridors of royal palaces and the bustling medieval streets of Paris, Philip worked tirelessly to knit France into a tightly woven tapestry. He centralized administration, imposed reforms with the force of law, and above all, sought to diminish the power of any faction or institution that might challenge the crown's supremacy. His ministers, hand-picked for loyalty and competence, helped him construct a government where even the most powerful noble felt the king's firm hand hovering above. Justice became harsher, the royal court more esteemed, but also more feared. The king's justice, it was said, was as cold and cutting as the winter north wind. Yet nowhere did his resolve display itself more dramatically than in his dealings with the Knights Templar. The Order, a brotherhood of monks and warriors born in the fires of the Crusades, had become, over the course of 2 centuries, rulers in their own right. Their vast network of strongholds, their wealth, born not only of battlefield plunder, but adept banking and international trade, made them indispensable and, to Philip's mind, intolerable. To the world, the Templars were defenders of Christendom, men of virtue and secrecy, guardians of the last remaining hopes for the Holy Land. To Philip, they were an enigma and a threat. A state within the state, loyal above all to their own Grand Master and the distant Pope, immune to royal taxes, and holding in their fortresses both treasures and secrets. France's wars with England and the mounting costs thereof had emptied Philip's treasury again and again. In those desperate hours, it was the Templars who extended loans to the crown, loans which came with embarrassment and resentment, for the king found himself more debtor than sovereign in their eyes. His suspicions deepened as his dependents did, and soon every rumor of strange rites, forbidden knowledge, heresy, was met with grim attention. The time for patience ended in October 1307. At dawn, across all of France, the king's men moved with silent coordination. Grand Master Jacques de Molay and countless brothers of the Temple were seized, wrenched from their beds or altars under accusations of heresy, blasphemy, and unspeakable corruption. The charges, secret rituals, idolatry, sodomy, and spitting on the cross, were as severe as they were vague, designed to horrify the public and break any support for the order outside the king's reach. Interrogations began at once in the bowels of Paris and a dozen other cities. Torture twisted confessions from men unaccustomed to such cruelty. And those confessions, publicly read, carefully documented, provided the king with justification in the eyes of both his subjects and the Pope. Yet not all believed. Among the whispers of the capital and in the grand cathedrals, people wondered whether the king's aim was true justice or simply the plundering of an inconvenient rival's treasure. The Templars' vast wealth was seized, their lands commandeered, and their fortresses fallen quiet one by one. Pope Clement V, himself a Frenchman ensnared in Philip's web, hesitated, torn between defending the order and appeasing the king who had brought even Rome itself to heel. Eventually, faced with relentless pressure, he sanctioned a wavering investigation, a token gesture, and allowed Philip to dispose of the knights as he saw fit. At the Council of Vienne in 1312, the order was formally dissolved, its legacy condemned to shadow and ruin. Their lands were nominally transferred to the Hospitallers, but in reality, much found its way into the grasp of the crown. Jacques de Molay, the last Grand Master, refused to capitulate entirely. In 1314, after years of imprisonment and torment, he was burned alive on a small island in the Seine, facing the towers of Notre Dame as the Parisian dusk set into trembling embers. Onlookers swore that in his final breath, he called down the judgment of God upon Philip and Pope Clement both, an imprecation that seemed realized when, within a year, both men died, and within decades, the Capetian line was broken. Yet for Philip, the suppression of the Templars was not simply destruction for its own sake. It was an assertion that nothing, no brotherhood, no church, no noble, stood above the crown, not in France. It was the final stone in the foundation of his absolutism, a grim but orderly legacy for a nation that longed for peace, if at the price of mercy. Beyond the drama of the Templar affair, the king's life settled into an austere, almost monastic routine. Each day was given to statecraft, to the writing and reviewing of edicts, to overseeing the collection of taxes and the appointment of judges, to policing the ever-present threats of insurrection and intrigue. He rarely laughed. His gaze, once so striking in youth, had become a mask, unreadable and often unnerving to those who served him. The Queen, Jeanne of Navarre, remained his companion, though the intimacy of their earliest years faded into a partnership of duty more than affection. A quiet accord forged from mutual respect in a world of ambitions. In his later years, Philip took to walking the silent corridors of the Louvre long after midnight, lantern light flickering on ancient suits of armor and tapestries faded by centuries of dust. Sometimes he would stand at high windows, looking out over the rooftops of Paris, so different from the rain-soaked, uncertain city of his youth. Now it was his city, his realm, his legacy. Yet as he considered all that he had built and all that he had torn down, he could not quite escape the cold certainty that power was both shield and prison. If France had been made greater by his sacrifices, Philip gave little outward sign of pride. He had banished uncertainty, conquered division, and bent even the church to his will. But the corridors of royal power remained, as ever, shadowed by silence. For every enemy crushed, a dozen more emerged from the darkness. And so the king pressed on, firm and alone, the architect of an age marked indelibly by his iron hand, the age of Philip the Fair. The final years of Philip IV's reign were bathed in a somber, wintry light. The king who had so methodically shaped and disciplined France now found himself encircled by the consequences of his dominion and the slow, relentless closing of his time. His once youthful beauty, which had given him the name Le Bel, faded beneath the burden of kingship, his eyes deepening with fatigue, his motions heavy with the gravity of absolute power. France, unified under his cold authority, had grown rich, orderly and formidable, yet the king's victories left him haunted. The dissolution of the Templars had filled his coffers, but in its wake, unease spread through noble and commoner alike. Many whispered of the dying curse of Jacques de Molay, and the streets of Paris were alive with stories of ominous signs. The sudden death of Pope Clement V in 1314, barely a year after de Molay's execution, appeared to some as proof of divine retribution. Philip himself, ever the rationalist, dismissed such tales, but he carried the knowledge of what had been done as a private, silent ache. Philip's days became more solitary. Jeanne of Navarre had passed away in 1305, and though he took another wife, it was more a matter of state than heart. His sons, Louis, Philip, and Charles, were growing into men beneath his close, demanding gaze. He sought to mold them as he had been molded, sharpening their minds for the throne, warning them of betrayal and the endless, lonely work of kingship. But he could not bequeath them his own mixture of resolve and restraint. He sometimes feared, in those rare moments of candid reflection, that what made him fit to rule was a soul forged by sacrifice few could bear. Still, the affairs of state never ceased. Philip pressed forward with tax reforms, hoping to ensure prosperity and stability. He continued his sometimes ruthless pursuit of royal justice, overseeing the suppression of banditry and challenges to crown authority. The bureaucracy he built pressed deeper into every corner of France. No village, it seemed, lay outside the purview of the king's officials. Even the church, cowed by his maneuvers, now bowed to secular interests, as Avignon became for a time the new center of papal power, a consequence of Philip's confrontations with the popes in Rome. Yet for all his control, the realm was restless. The legacy of the Templars lingered as a shadow. Noble families debated the future, suspicious of any who had gained from the order's fall. The peasantry grumbled about taxes, and bands of outlaws prowled the woods, defying the king's soldiers. France remained powerful, but the kind of order Philip had achieved was brittle, strong so long as its maker remained to enforce it. In the spring of 1314, fate dealt Philip a blow that seemed cut from the cruelest histories of his own past. News reached Paris that his sons' wives, the queens of France and Navarre, were implicated in a scandalous affair, accused of adultery in the infamous Tour de Nesle affair. Philip responded with icy swiftness, ordering their arrest and imprisonment. The scandal shook the royal family, sowing discord and suspicion even at the very top of the Capetian line. The king had crushed the Templars and humbled popes, but within his own blood, chaos found root. Above all, Philip became afflicted by a peculiar, relentless pain. In the autumn of 1314, while out hunting in the forest of Fontainebleau, he suffered a terrible riding accident. He returned to Paris gravely injured, and the wound and fever kept him bedridden. He refused to give up his daily duties, summoning scribes and counselors to his chamber, signing documents with a trembling hand. Still, each day, the pain grew worse, and his breath became short. His final days were marked by storms and heavy rain over the Île-de-France, as if the heavens themselves wept for the end of a difficult reign. Few were permitted into his presence. Only his sons, the most trusted servants, and a handful of priests. The gloom of the palace, the sound of water against the old stones, and the flickering candlelight were the king's companions. On 29th November 1314, Philip IV died. His passing was quiet. No oratory, no grand last words, only a slow surrender to the dark. He left behind a France both stronger and more troubled than he had found it. The foundations of a powerful monarchy, but also bitter divisions, wounds from which legends would grow. Many remembered the prophecy uttered by de Molay, and the end of Philip's reign did little to dispel those superstitions. Over the next years, each of his 3 sons would briefly inherit the throne, only for the Capetian dynasty to falter and vanish, as though the land itself resisted the legacy of its cold, beautiful king. And yet, history would remember Philip not only for his severity and triumphs, nor merely for the tragedy that haunted his last days. He became the forerunner of the French absolute monarchy, shaping the crown into a force greater than any single man or institution. France bore the stamp of his ambitions, its future echoing with the silent authority he cultivated. A king remembered not for warmth, but for the unyielding discipline that defined an era. Even as his tomb was sealed and the winter winds swept the royal crypt, Philip IV's spirit marched on in stone and law. And somewhere, perhaps, the memory of the Templars and their final fiery hour lingered still, woven into the heart of a kingdom forever marked by the reign of Philip the Fair. If the life of Philip the Fair ended in the hushed anxiety of a rain-lashed November night, his legacy did not fade so easily. France itself was changed forever by his touch, and those who followed in his wake his children, his enemies, his people, lived in the shadow of the world he shaped. The most immediate result of his passing was the instability of the crown itself. Though he had left no enemies on the field, Philip's sons found uneasy thrones. Each, in turn, assumed the mantle of kingship, but none ruled long nor peacefully. Louis the Vix, his eldest, lasted less than 2 years, his reign marked by tumult and scandal. Philip V and Charles IV, likewise, were haunted by conspiracies, questions of legitimacy, and the sense that the kingdom itself was restless, waiting for the old strength of their father, which could not be summoned by birthright alone. The line of the Capetians faltered and died, as Jacques de Molay's legendary curse foretold, ushering in the era of the 100 Years' War. Distant cousins, the Valois, claimed the throne, and for generations France would bleed in dynastic struggle. In the haunted corridors of the Louvre, and in the restless hearts of peasantry and nobility alike, rumor and prophecy wove together, entwining the memory of the Templars' execution with every misfortune visited upon the land. Yet Philip's deeper legacy lay not in famines or curses, but in the architecture of power he left behind. The monarchy, for all its temporary fragility, was stronger and more centralized than at any time in French history. He had ground down the pride of the barons, he had bent the will of the church, and he had made the law, codified, enforced, and inescapable, the new spine of the kingdom. His creation of a bureaucracy, loyal only to the crown, would survive dynasties and defeat, forming the template on which later kings, Louis XV, Francis I, and above all, Louis XIV, would shape the dazzling iron-willed spectacle of absolute monarchy. The echoes of Philip's reign passed across centuries. The memory of the Templars' last stand, their shadowy rituals and flaming death, grew into an undying legend. Mystics, poets, and rebels made of their fall a perpetual symbol of the battle between worldly and spiritual power. Even centuries later, revolutionaries and monarchists alike looked back to the reign of Philip IV as the moment where the true, unyielding France was first born. In stern justice, in relentless order, in the cold certainty that law and king must become one. Thus, in the candle glow of monasteries, in the whispered prayers of kings and peasants, and in the silence over the ashes of burned temples, lived the silent testament of Philip the Fair, a monarch who strove for unity and strength. Often at the cost of mercy and warmth, he left to France both a warning and an example, that greatness carries a price, and that behind every mask of beauty and order there may lie a heart hardened by sorrow, vision, and the burdens of rule. History, ever hungry for judgment, rendered its own verdict in the centuries that followed. France would rise and fall, bleed and rejoice, but in every age there would remain a trace of the iron hand, the distant gaze, and the restless will of Philip. And in the memory of a kingdom, the legend of the king who made France his own.